I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case. I remember the stillness of that night in Oxford, the city wrapped in a damp fog that seemed to settle into the very bones of the place, the sort of fog that leaves one's thoughts heavier, as though each step is a reluctant push against the weight of an unspoken memory. As I walked the streets alone, my footsteps muffled by the soft mist, I couldn't help but feel as if the very air itself had grown tired. Exhausted with time and the secrets it keeps, there was a certain melancholy that clung to Oxford's ancient stones at that hour. The walls of the colleges, worn with age, seemed to listen as much as they spoke. I have often thought that the buildings of this city are far more observant than most people would give them credit for. They bear witness to everything, but never speak of it. Sometimes in the quiet of the night, I half expect them to reveal their secrets, as if I might hear the voices of long-forgotten scholars and students, their words lingering in the damp air like the last echoes of a symphony. But they never do. They remain silent. I had only just begun my walk, drifting through the rain-soaked streets when the phone call came. The voice on the other end was Lewis's, steady but tinged with that peculiar tension that accompanies a discovery. "Sir," he said, "there's been a death. An unusual one, I think, at the old manor on the outskirts of town." I didn't need to ask which manor. The old place had a reputation, a crumbling, isolated estate, long abandoned by all but those who had no place else to go. The kind of house that seems to exist outside of time, where every creaking floorboard whispers of forgotten stories. I've always found a certain irony in the idea that such a place, so steeped in quiet neglect, could be the stage for something as violent and disruptive as death. I arrived at the manor not long after. It loomed in the fog like a forgotten relic from some half-remembered dream. Its windows were dark, offering no sign of life within, and yet I knew there was something about the place that was never truly empty. People came and went in their own ways. The body, I was told, had been found in one of the rooms, though not in the usual manner. The victim was Dr. Timothy Ellison, a man of no particular repute, at least not in the academic circles that I was familiar with. A failed scholar, perhaps, but what brought him to this forsaken house was a matter I would have to figure out for myself. As I stood in the doorway, a sharp, disquieting thought flickered in my mind. There was something about the timing of it all, something deeply wrong in the way this event seemed to echo against the walls of the city. I couldn't explain it, not yet, but I could feel it. The way the air seemed to shift when I stepped inside, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make sense of it. The clock on the mantel, I noted with some discomfort, had stopped at midnight. I don't believe in superstition, not really, but in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that the old timepiece's failure was somehow significant. Time had indeed stopped for Dr. Ellison, but what of the rest of us? Perhaps, like the clock, we were all simply waiting for the inevitable moment when we, too, would cease to move forward. I glanced around the room, my eyes lingering on the bookshelves, the scattered papers, the half-open window. Everything was in its place, and yet nothing seemed as it should be. It was a puzzle, of course, but one I knew would not reveal itself quickly. Such things rarely do. And for now I would have to trust the quiet, patient rhythm of my thoughts to guide me through the fog. The case had begun, but there was no rush. It would twist as all things do with every hour. I can still recall the moment I first heard his name, Dr. Timothy Ellison. A name not unfamiliar to me, yet it sat oddly on my tongue as I repeated it. How strange that a man I had never truly known could have such an immediate effect on my thoughts. It was the kind of name that carried the faint echo of an old academic debate, the reverberation of someone slightly out of reach. Perhaps a man who once mattered, but only to those who had the patience to remember him. Ellison, I was told, had been a scholar of modest renown, known in certain circles for his unconventional views on literature and philosophy. He had come to Oxford years ago, eager and hopeful, but the promise of youth is rarely enough to hold the attention of the university's more established minds. I knew the type, the brilliant but flawed academic, the man who could never quite conform to the expectations of his peers. Ellison had never quite fit, as I soon discovered. His brilliance, though undeniable, had been tinged with a peculiar sort of arrogance. He had alienated many along the way, becoming something of an academic pariah, and yet, when I stood in that dimly lit manner, gazing at the place where he had met his end, I could not help but wonder what had brought him here, what had led him to this forsaken house, this decaying shell of a place that had long since been abandoned by the world. The manor had a certain weariness to it, as though it had accepted its fate long ago, like a man who, having reached the end of his life, resigns himself to the inevitable. There was something about the house that mirrored Ellison's own academic decline. The overgrown gardens, the cracked windows, the neglected bookshelves. It was all there, a reflection of a man whose mind had once been sharp, but had been dulled over time by the weight of his own failures. I sat in Ellison's study, the room heavy with the scent of old paper, and let my thoughts drift back to the man. There were few clues here, aside from the books, scattered papers, and an overwhelming sense of disarray. Ellison had been working on something in the months before his death, though what it was I could not say. There were no grand theories here, no revolutionary ideas, only fragments, half-finished thoughts, and there, among the piles of discarded notes, was a name that struck me like a sudden realization. Dr. Caldwell. I had not heard that name in years. Dr. Caldwell was a name that lingered at the edges of my memory, like a fading photograph. Caldwell had been one of those men, one of the brilliant, unyielding scholars who existed in a world of their own, a man whose theories had once clashed violently with Ellison's own. The two had been locked in a rivalry that had been the subject of whispered conversations in academic circles, though never quite openly acknowledged. A rivalry marked by sharp words and subtle betrayals, the kind that leaves behind only bitterness and regret. Why, I wondered, had Ellison continued to study Caldwell's work so intently, long after their differences had driven them apart? Why had he clung to the man's ideas with such obsession, even to the point of alienating those who might have still been willing to call him a friend? Perhaps the answer lay in the same place where all academic feuds begin: pride, a desire to prove oneself, to prove one's worth against the odds, to be seen as something more than a shadow in the corner of someone else's brilliance. And yet, as I thought of Caldwell, I couldn't help but wonder if the man himself had ever truly understood what he had lost in that rivalry. Was it even possible to regret such a thing, when one's pride had long since become the very foundation of their existence? As I stood up and made my way toward the door, I took one last look at the study. The room with its scattered papers and empty chair seemed to be holding its breath, as though waiting for me to make some connection, to solve some puzzle that was not yet clear. The fog outside had thickened, obscuring the view from the window, and I knew that it would take time, more time than I cared to admit, before I would fully understand the tangled web Ellison had left behind. The case, I thought, was just beginning. And though I had not yet found the key, I could sense that somewhere hidden in the folds of this man's life lay the answer. It was there, waiting to be uncovered. The first time I came across it was in the pages of Dr. Ellison's final manuscript, a jumble of loosely connected thoughts on the nature of truth in literature. I had naturally expected something more methodical, something that might make me pause and appreciate its depth, but instead I found words that didn't quite fit, thoughts that twisted in on themselves, like a circle too tight to complete. There was a particular line that caught my attention, a fragment of poetry buried in a passage about Shakespeare, or rather, a misquote of Shakespeare. A small thing, one would think, to a casual observer, but in my line of work, one learns that even the most inconsequential detail often holds more weight than the grandest conclusions. The misquote was subtle, almost imperceptible. Ellison had attributed a line from Hamlet to the wrong character. It was, in a sense, an innocent mistake, one that any amateur might make in the course of trying to recall something too quickly. But there was something in the way Ellison had written it, something that made me feel for the briefest moment as though he were trying to tell me something he didn't want to say outright. The line in question was, of course, "To thine own self be true," a sentiment that anyone might consider a simple reflection on personal integrity. But in the context of Ellison's work, it seemed to carry a weight far greater than the original line ever could. The wrong attribution, giving it to Hamlet rather than Polonius, hinted at a deeper fracture, an internal division in Ellison's own mind, one that I wasn't sure he had even recognized himself. It was as if he had been deliberately distorting his own perceptions, bending the meaning of something to suit his own sense of moral confusion. I remember staring at that page for longer than I should have. A careless mistake, surely, but I couldn't help but wonder. What had driven Ellison to that point? What was it that made him alter, even for a moment, the simplest of truths? It was perhaps a reflection of the way he had lived his life, constantly misplacing the finer details, misreading the most obvious cues. I shared the thought with Lewis later that afternoon, though not in so many words. He had come into the room, as he always did, with that brief, almost apologetic glance, the kind of look that suggested I might have a drink before I asked him to perform some tedious task. I had, of course, poured myself a glass of whiskey, a small indulgence to help me consider the case in peace. We discussed the manuscript, and I mentioned the misquote. Lewis, as expected, had little to say. He was always more concerned with the facts, the things he could see. But I had learned over the years that the answers rarely lay in what could be seen. The most important truths are those we overlook. Still, even as I spoke of the misquote, I could feel something shifting in the back of my mind. The feeling was faint, but I couldn't quite shake it. A man doesn't misquote Shakespeare by accident. It wasn't that the mistake was a deliberate signpost to something larger, but it was a piece of the puzzle, a thread that might lead to something else, something just beyond reach. Later that evening, I took to walking again. The rain had begun to fall, light at first, but gaining strength as I crossed the stone-paved paths of Oxford. The air had that peculiar clarity, the kind that only follows a downpour, when the city smells of wet stone and old paper. I walked with no particular destination in mind, letting the rhythm of the steps guide me. The misquote, that single error in Ellison's work, gnawed at me. I knew there was something there, something buried beneath the surface of his scattered thoughts, and it was in the rhythm of those footsteps that I felt the whisper of it again. Ellison had altered a piece of poetry, not by accident, but perhaps in an attempt to rewrite something about himself, to make sense of a life he could no longer comprehend. The irony, of course, was that in doing so, he had exposed his own inner turmoil, and it was now my task to understand that turmoil, to pull back the layers of his confusion and pride, and to find the truth hidden beneath. And yet, as I stood under the dim streetlights, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, much like the misquote, was something I would never fully grasp. Perhaps that was the greatest tragedy of all, that the answers we seek are often too elusive, too insubstantial to hold. The night pressed on, and with it, the case deepened. I suppose there are many ways in which one can pass a life. Some are spent in pursuit of glory, others in the quiet contemplation of books. Some choose to live with passion, others with restraint. Dr. Timothy Ellison, as I came to learn, had chosen a curious blend of the two. It was opera, of all things, that seemed to hold his attention at the end, the great tragic arias that filled the night air with longing and sorrow. His final days had been marked by an obsession with an opera he could never quite attend, as if the music itself could cleanse him of some invisible sin. I first encountered Julia Trent in Ellison's study. She was sitting at the desk, hands folded in front of her, her eyes vacant in a way that suggested her mind was elsewhere, lost in some private reflection. She had been Ellison's lover once, or perhaps it was better to say that they had shared an affection that never truly blossomed. She spoke little of him directly, though I could see in the way she held herself that his death had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Her presence in the study seemed almost too fitting. A woman of no particular significance, caught in the shadow of a man who had never quite known how to reconcile his own contradictions. Julia had a look about her that suggested she had once been more, though she had long since abandoned that notion. She had the air of someone who had been accustomed to disappointment, who had come to accept that the things she desired, love, recognition, would forever be beyond her reach. It was as we spoke that the topic of Ellison's obsession with opera first came up. She confessed, been the one to introduce him to the work of Verdi, to the soaring crescendos of La Traviata, to the tragic beauty of Aida, but it was the aria from Don Giovanni that had become his particular obsession in the months leading up to his death. A piece that, she explained, he had planned to perform in a concert that never took place. He had spoken of it constantly, rehearsing the words in his head, as if the performance could somehow right some wrong that had been committed long ago. I could see that the music meant something deeper to him than mere indulgence. There was a melancholy in Ellison's love for opera, a longing that mirrored his own academic pursuits, a constant striving towards something unattainable, something beyond his grasp. It was this paradox that had defined his existence. A brilliant mind, yes, but one that had never quite found its place. And now, even in death, he remained trapped in the echo of a song he would never sing. As I left the study, Julia's words lingered with me. She had said little, but there was an unspoken heaviness in her silence. I had learned long ago that people rarely said what they meant. Most of us are not that honest with ourselves, let alone with others. There was something about Julia's indifference, something about the way she looked at me with those tired eyes, that unsettled me. She had known Ellison, yes, but did she really know him? Or had she simply allowed herself to be swept along by the currents of his unfulfilled desires? The opera was not, of course, the key to the case, not in any direct sense. But as I sat in the quiet of my own study later that evening, I found myself mulling over the significance of music in Ellison's life. How curious it was that a man who had dedicated himself to intellectual pursuits should turn to something as emotionally raw as opera in his final days. Music has a way of stripping us bare, of exposing the parts of ourselves that we would rather keep hidden. Perhaps Ellison had been searching for something in the music, something that would allow him to make peace with his own disillusionment. I thought of the aria, the one he could never perform, and felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of connection to the man. In that moment, I realized that Ellison's life had been a kind of opera in itself, full of moments of brilliance and grandeur, yet ultimately tragic, doomed to a final note that would never be heard. He had sought meaning, yes, but had failed to find it. Like the rest of us, he had searched for something to fill the silence, only to find that the more he sought, the emptier it became. I took another sip of whiskey and let the bitter warmth settle in my chest. There was no great revelation here, no sudden clarity. But as I sat in the dim light of my study, I couldn't shake the feeling that the answer, like the final notes of an unfinished aria, was just out of reach. The case twisted with every hour, and with it I knew the opera of Ellison's life would continue to haunt me, playing its mournful refrain long after I had solved the mystery. The puzzle had sat there for days, and I had only just noticed it, a small thing, half buried under the weight of more pressing concerns. It wasn't the sort of clue that demanded attention, not at first glance, but there it was on the corner of Ellison's desk, where the light from the window seemed to fall just right, illuminating the edges of a discarded newspaper. A crossword puzzle, a trivial pursuit to most, and yet I found myself drawn to it. It wasn't the puzzle itself that caught my eye. No, it was the way one particular clue was answered. It was a minor thing, barely worth the ink it had been written in, a 5-letter word for false. The answer, faux, seemed as harmless as any other, but in the context of Ellison's life it felt wrong. There had been something about the way he had circled it, as though he had taken some secret pleasure in the word's meaning. Foe, a lie, a shadow of the truth. A falsehood that was never quite big enough to be noticed, but was always present, lurking beneath the surface. It seemed so out of place in the context of the other answers. Most of them were straightforward, almost too easy for someone like Ellison. He had, no doubt, filled them in mechanically, the way someone follows a pattern without ever thinking about it. But not this one. No, this answer was deliberate. It stood apart, as if it were a reminder, a key to something I hadn't yet understood. I could feel the tension in the air, a stillness that had settled over me ever since I first set foot in Ellison's study. It was the kind of quiet that fills a room with questions, the kind of silence that holds its breath, waiting for something to happen. And as I stared at that one clue, I realized that the silence was not merely the absence of sound. It was the presence of something hidden, something that had been carefully concealed, just out of sight. I considered the possibility that it was nothing more than a passing fancy, a casual mistake, the sort of thing that anyone might overlook. But I didn't believe in coincidences, not anymore. There was a reason Ellison had answered that clue in that particular way, a reason I was not yet ready to see, though it had been staring at me from the page all along. I reached for the glass of whiskey on the table beside me, the liquid a comforting warmth in the midst of the cool air. It was a habit, of course, this drinking, a small indulgence to ease the tension of the mind. But that night, as I sipped the amber liquid, I found myself thinking not of the puzzle, but of the man who had created it. Ellison, whose life had been filled with half-truths and contradictions, had been searching for something in those 5 little letters. What was it he had hoped to find? What was it he had hoped to conceal? There was a coldness in his study, a sense that he had been grasping at something just beyond his reach, something that had always been just out of view. And as the minutes passed, I realized that the crossword puzzle, with its neatly filled-in answers, was a mirror of his life. Neat on the surface, but fractured beneath. A man whose public persona had been composed of little more than false answers, carefully curated to hide the truth. I had learned to look for these small details, to find the meaning in the things that others would dismiss as inconsequential. It was not always the grand gestures, the overt displays of emotion that held the answers. Sometimes it was something as trivial as a crossword puzzle clue. It was as if Ellison had wanted to leave behind a message for someone who would understand, someone who could read between the lines and see the falsehoods for what they were. As I sat there in the quiet of the room, the pieces of the puzzle began to shift. The answer, though simple, felt like a key that might unlock something deeper, something hidden within the layers of Ellison's life. What had he been trying to conceal? What had he been pretending to be? It was a question that would stay with me unanswered for hours. A clue that led nowhere and everywhere at once, its meaning as elusive as the truth itself. The puzzle was nothing, and yet it was everything. A small detail, unnoticed by most, but somehow the most telling of them all. I set the glass down, my thoughts still caught on that one word. Faux. False. It seemed so simple, so insignificant, and yet in that moment it felt as if it were the only thing that mattered. It had been lying there for days, that letter, tucked in the corner of Ellison's desk, like a forgotten relic from another time. I had passed it by several times, unassuming, like any of the other papers scattered across the table. It was the envelope that caught my attention in the end, its worn edges, the postmark dated just a day after Ellison's death. It looked out of place amid the ordinary clutter of the study, as though it had been waiting for someone to notice it. And so I did. The paper was thin, the handwriting slanted and sharp, the kind of script that feels almost too deliberate, as if the writer had taken pains to make each letter stand just so. The ink had bled slightly in places, the sort of thing that happens when you're writing quickly, desperately even, perhaps. But it wasn't the handwriting that caught my attention. It was the fact that the letter had never been opened. I can't say why exactly, But there was something profoundly unsettling about it, as if the letter's contents were too dangerous to reveal or too painful to acknowledge. I hadn't intended to open it, not at first. I simply wanted to understand why it had been left untouched, but as I held it in my hands, I felt the weight of it, as though it had been waiting for me, calling to me in a way that I couldn't quite explain. The air in the room felt heavier somehow, the silence pressing in on me, thick and full of expectation. I could feel my pulse quicken as I carefully slid my finger beneath the flap and peeled it open. The letter was brief, cryptic, and damning all at once. It wasn't a confession, not in any direct sense, but it was a message, one that had been left for Ellison and for anyone who might come after him. There were no formalities, no introduction, just a single line written in that same hurried hand. The truth is hidden where only you would look. It struck me then, the weight of those words. They were a challenge, a riddle, a map leading to a place that no one, least of all Ellison, could find easily. It was a clue, or perhaps a taunt, written in the moment of some final, desperate attempt to set things right. But what, I wondered, had Ellison been trying to set right? What truth had he been seeking that could not be found in the open air, but only in some hidden recess of his life, his mind, his history? I set the letter down on the desk and stepped back, feeling the weight of it still in my hands. There was something in the simplicity of the words that was at once unsettling and revealing. It was as if Ellison had known that the truth would never be found in any of the obvious places, never in the books he had written or the lectures he had given. Perhaps he had understood that there were things buried in the corners of his past that could never be unearthed without consequence. I thought of Julia Trent, sitting in her distant corner of the world, staring blankly at the walls, pretending that she had no more to give, no more to reveal. She had known Ellison, of course. She had been part of his life, part of whatever it was that had driven him to seek out the truth that would never come. And yet when I had asked her about the letter, she had said nothing, not a word. She had looked at me with those empty eyes, the eyes of someone who had long ago stopped searching for answers. It was as if the letter had been left for me, not as a clue to the crime, but as a question I had yet to answer. The truth, it seemed, was not something that could be found in the obvious places, in the spaces where the light shone brightest. No, it was hidden in the shadows, where only a few would ever think to look. As I stood there, the letter still resting on the desk, I realized that I was no closer to understanding Ellison than I had been when I first arrived at the manor. The letter, with its cryptic words, had only deepened the mystery, cast it into sharper relief. And yet, even as I stood there, I knew that the answer, whatever it was, would not come easily. It was hidden, just as the letter had said, and I would have to search in places I had not yet thought to look. I placed the letter back in its envelope, carefully folding the flap over the opening. There were things I had yet to understand, but one thing was clear. The truth, like the letter itself, had been left unopened for a reason, and it was only a matter of time before I would have to face whatever it was that lay hidden beneath the surface. It was a scrap of paper, as innocuous as any other, but there it was, nestled between the pages of an old ledger, forgotten in the bottom drawer of Ellison's desk. I'd passed by that drawer at least half a dozen times, each time believing there was nothing left to find, that I had already searched the depths of this man's life, that there were no more secrets to uncover. But then sometimes it is the most insignificant thing that reveals the deepest truth. I'd been looking for something solid, something tangible, and in the end it was a whisper that I heard. A torn piece of paper. The page had been torn hastily, its edges uneven and frayed, as though someone had ripped it out in desperation. It was clear it hadn't been meant to be found. The ink was faded in places, the writing cramped, hurried, as though the writer had been trying to commit thoughts to paper before they vanished altogether. The page had been hidden so carefully, wedged between 2 volumes of literature. Ellison's favorite, I suspect. Poetry and philosophy. the sort of material a man like him would have considered essential. But the diary entry on that scrap of paper had nothing to do with words or grand ideas. It was raw, visceral, personal, a glimpse of the man himself. It read simply, "He knows. He must know by now. But I can't let him see it. Not yet. Not until it's too late." I stared at the words for what seemed like hours. There was no name, no context. But the implication was clear. Someone knew something. Someone was on the verge of discovering something that had been buried, deliberately concealed. And Ellison, in that final frantic attempt, had sought to keep it hidden, as if the truth, once revealed, would unravel the very fabric of his carefully constructed life. But who was this he? And what was it that was so dangerous, so destructive, that it could not be seen until it was far too late? There was a palpable silence in the room, thick with the weight of the words that still hovered in the air. My thoughts swirled around the page, caught in a web of assumptions and half-formed conclusions. It felt like a key, yes, but it was one that could unlock more than I was prepared to understand. I had seen such things before. People driven to madness by the pressure of their own lies, twisting the truth until it became something unrecognizable. But this was different. There was a precision to it, a calculation that hinted at a far more intricate puzzle than I had anticipated. I placed the page back in its hiding spot, my fingers trembling slightly as I closed the drawer. The room, despite its familiarity, seemed suddenly unfamiliar, as if it too had changed under the weight of the discovery. The air was thicker now, and the shadows, once comfortably distant, seemed to creep closer. I felt the familiar pull of the case, the need to uncover what had been hidden, but I could no longer dismiss the sense of unease that had begun to gnaw at me. I knew then that I had crossed a line. There was no turning back now. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I wandered through Oxford's streets in the misty twilight, the city's damp stone underfoot echoing in my thoughts, but I could no longer focus. The quiet chatter of the few souls still about seemed to echo in my mind, mocking me with their normality. The rain, light but persistent, drummed against my coat as I walked, my hands shoved deep in my pockets, the letter tucked inside a fold, the diary page still burning in my mind's eye. What had Ellison been so desperate to hide? What had he known? The question gnawed at me as I stood outside the gates of the college, the cold air biting at my face. But the answer was always just beyond my grasp, like the distant sound of an opera, beautiful, haunting, but forever out of reach. The night seemed to press in on me, a dark and unyielding thing, and I knew deep down that I was no closer to the truth than I had been when I first walked into the manor. But there was one thing I was sure of. Ellison had known something. And whatever it was, it had been buried so deeply that even he could not escape it. And now as I stood there in the rain, I understood. The puzzle was far from over. The page, though insignificant in the grand scheme of things, had unlocked something inside me. Something that had remained dormant since the first day I began this investigation. It was a whisper, yes, but whispers have a way of growing louder, and soon enough they would lead to the truth. But what would I find then? What if the truth was something I could not bear to hear? I turned, the cold wind stinging my cheeks, and walked back into the heart of Oxford, the case still clinging to me like the rain on my coat. It was late, later than I had intended to stay in the office. But then, the nights have a way of stretching into eternity when you're chasing shadows. I had grown used to the solitary hours, the empty stillness of the study, where the only sounds were the faint scratching of pen on paper and the distant echo of the clock ticking in the hallway. It was a kind of comfort, the quiet resignation of a world that kept moving even when you didn't know where you were heading. But tonight, I felt a strange urgency creeping into me. A need to resolve something, anything. The pieces of Ellison's life had been scattered before me for days. Clues, half-answers, dead ends. I thought of the crossword clue, the misquoted verse, the letter left unopened. I thought of the shadows in his study, the way everything seemed to be carefully arranged for a purpose I hadn't yet uncovered. But there it was. A solution, or at least a solution that almost fit. It came like a flash of insight, a sudden rearranging of the pieces that seemed to make sense at the time. I had spent the better part of the evening going through Ellison's papers again, more methodically this time when I stumbled upon a letter, not one that had been hidden or discarded, but one from an academic colleague, Dr. Caldwell. It was a brief exchange, but the tone was sharp, the words clipped, a reminder of the rivalry that had once consumed them both. The letter spoke of a disagreement, nothing more than academic posturing, at least on the surface. But as I read it for the fourth or fifth time, a certain line struck me. Your theories are as dangerous as they are foolish, Timothy. If you insist on following this path, I can only imagine the consequences. There it was. It seemed too clean, too perfect. Caldwell, the rival, the adversary. Was this it? Was this the break I had been searching for? I saw the case unfolding in front of me. Ellison had crossed a line in his work, pushed too far into dangerous territory, and Caldwell, in his own way, had tried to warn him. The rivalry had gone too far, and someone, perhaps Caldwell himself, had been driven to eliminate Ellison to stop him from revealing some terrible truth. It was so neat, so simple, that for a moment I allowed myself to believe it. I could already see the scene playing out in my mind. Caldwell, furious and desperate, confronting Ellison. The argument escalating, a single act of violence, the kind of thing that so often lies beneath the surface of academic pride. It felt almost too easy, like a puzzle that had been put together by someone else. I took a slow sip of whiskey, letting the warmth settle in my chest. The solution, this theory that had emerged so suddenly, felt almost right. And yet, there was something in the back of my mind that gnawed at me, a sense that I was missing something crucial. There had to be more. There always was. I set the letter aside and turned back to the rest of Ellison's papers. The quiet of the room seemed to press in on me, thick and suffocating. I tried to think, to focus on the facts, but they eluded me, slipping like water through my fingers. I had worked myself into a corner, seeing only what I wanted to see. And it wasn't until I noticed the tiniest of details that the picture began to shift again. It was a passing mention in a book he had underlined, a reference to a place, a moment in time, an event long forgotten. I should have seen it earlier, but I'd been so eager to solve the case, to bring it to a close, that I hadn't considered the possibility that I was overlooking something far more significant. The truth, as always, was hiding in the smallest of details, the ones that are too easy to dismiss. And then it hit me. The rivalry with Caldwell, the letter, the argument. Yes, perhaps it had contributed, but it wasn't the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter lay elsewhere, hidden in the layers of Ellison's life that I hadn't yet fully explored. The solution I had so confidently arrived at was, in the end, a false one, a misdirection that had led me to a dead end. I stood up, pacing slowly around the room, my mind racing. I had been so close, almost, but that word, as I have often found, can be both a gift and a curse. It promises certainty, yet leaves you with nothing but the sharp edge of regret. The answer was still out there, buried beneath the weight of all the lies and misdirection waiting to be uncovered. And as I stood there in the quiet, the whiskey glass empty in my hand, I knew that I was far from finished. The case, like so many before it, would twist again, and I would have to find the patience to follow it wherever it led. But one thing was certain, the solution I had almost found would never be the right one, and so I waited, as I always do, for the next small clue to surface, the next whisper to guide me toward the truth. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow. The library at Oxford, with its dark oak shelves and thick, musty air, had always been a place of reverence for me. The smell of old paper, the silence that settled like a heavy curtain between the rows of books. It was a world apart, a sanctuary where nothing seemed to disturb the steady march of history. But on that day, as I walked through the quiet corridors, the weight of it all felt different. The stone beneath my feet, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, seemed to hum with a kind of anticipation. I had come to the library for something specific, or so I thought. There were connections I was still working to make, fragments of Ellison's life I was piecing together, but I found instead something I had not expected, something that had been waiting there for far longer than I had realized. It was a photograph, tucked between the pages of a dusty, forgotten volume on the top shelf. The photograph was simple, though it carried an unspoken weight. A black and white image, the edges curling slightly with age. There were no names, no dates, just a moment frozen in time. 3 men standing in front of a building that looked familiar, though I couldn't place it. The background was indistinct, blurred, but the men, their faces, their postures, were striking. The photograph had an intensity to it, a rawness that suggested these men were more than just acquaintances. They were in some way bound together, even if only by the moment in which they stood. I had no idea what drew me to it at first, but something in the way one of the men held himself caught my eye. He was standing slightly apart from the others, his face half obscured in shadow, but there was an unmistakable look in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or some deeper understanding that I could not name. The photograph seemed to hold a secret, and I could feel it as I stared at it, the faintest prickling of something just beyond my reach. I examined the photograph more closely, turning it over in my hands, hoping for some clue, some indication of its meaning. There on the back, scrawled in a hurried, unfamiliar hand, was a single name, Parker. Just that, no title, no explanation. A name, and yet somehow that was enough. Parker. The name felt heavy, as though it had some significance I was missing. I knew instinctively that it was not a name I had encountered before, but it was a name that seemed to carry the weight of something buried, something that had been concealed for too long. And then, in a quiet moment of clarity, I realized what the photograph was. It wasn't just a relic from the past. It was a key, an image that had been placed in the library, hidden among books that had not seen the light of day in years for a reason. The 3 men in the photograph were not merely casual acquaintances. They were connected to Ellison in a way that could not be ignored. I could feel it, a thread that ran through the very air of that place, linking them together across time. I could not yet see the full picture, but I could sense that this photograph, with its faded edges and obscure names, was a piece of the puzzle that had eluded me. The library, for all its stillness, was suddenly filled with a kind of restless energy. I turned the photograph over again, my mind racing. Who was Parker? Why had this image been placed here, hidden among the stacks, as if waiting for someone to find it? The answer, I knew, was somewhere in the archives of Oxford's past, in the dusty corners where forgotten memories lived. I could feel it in my bones, the unshakable certainty that this was no coincidence. But as I stood there, holding the photograph in my hands, I felt the familiar weight of frustration settle over me. The answer was so close, so painfully close, but it was still out of reach. I could almost hear the echoes of Ellison's voice in the quiet of the library, a voice that had been consumed by some dark knowledge, some secret that had driven him to the edge of his own existence. I tucked the photograph into my coat pocket and left the library, the weight of it still in my hand, still pressing on my chest. The night had fallen fully by the time I stepped out into the rain, and Oxford's streets, empty and silent, seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me. The photograph, I realized, was a clue, yes, but it was more than that. It was a promise of things yet to come, a door to a world I was only just beginning to understand. As the rain fell softly on the stone streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph had shifted something inside me. It had opened a door, and though I had no idea where it would lead, I knew with quiet certainty that I had no choice but to follow. The rain had begun to fall again, soft at first, a gentle rhythm against the window pane, but soon it picked up, turning the world outside into a blur of silver and grey. I sat by the desk, the light of the lamp casting long, crooked shadows across the room. The whiskey in my glass was still untouched, though my mind had long since drifted to places where even the strongest drink could not follow. The case, as I had known from the beginning, was never going to be simple, but there was something about this moment that felt different. It wasn't the discovery of a new clue or the unraveling of some grand mystery. No, it was the quiet realization that sometimes the most significant thing in a case is the absence of something, a clue that isn't there. I had spent hours, perhaps days, revisiting the same details, following the same paths, hoping for something to change. But in the end it was the silence that spoke the loudest, the absence of the one piece that I had so desperately wanted to find. I had been looking for something, some small definitive moment that would tie everything together, but there had been nothing. The absence of a clue became, in a strange way, its own kind of revelation. It was almost laughable in retrospect. I had been chasing shadows, convinced that something, anything, would reveal itself. But now, sitting in the quiet of the study, I could see how foolish I had been to believe that I could control the course of events. The truth was always just beyond my grasp, lurking in the corners of the case, waiting for me to stop trying so hard to force it into the shape I wanted. I thought of Ellison then, his life unraveling in the same way, unable to find the answers he so desperately sought. The clues he had left behind were too disjointed, too fragmented, and I had been trying to piece them together into something coherent. But perhaps that was the mistake, trying to force a pattern to create order where there was none. The clue that wasn't there had been the key all along. It was a lesson I had learned time and again in my life, though never without a quiet pang of regret. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of it all settle in my chest. The missing piece, the one I had convinced myself would provide the final answer, had never existed. The truth wasn't hidden behind some carefully crafted facade. It was in the spaces between, in the absence of the expected. Perhaps the greatest mystery of all was that there was no single revelation waiting to emerge. No dramatic moment of clarity that would solve everything. The case was too complex, too human, to be solved by a single clue. It was strange, really, how often we are led to believe that a mystery can be solved with the right piece of evidence, the right revelation, at the right time. And yet here I was, standing at the edge of it all, staring into the vast emptiness of a case that had no easy answer. The clue that wasn't there had shown me that much. As the rain continued to fall outside, the shadows in the room deepened. I reached for my glass, the amber liquid still waiting patiently, though I had no intention of drinking it just yet. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Perhaps the quiet to settle a little more, perhaps for the weight of it all to become a little easier to bear. But I wasn't sure that it ever would. I had followed the trail of evidence, piecing together the broken fragments of Ellison's life. But in the end, I had come to understand that some answers are never meant to be found. The absence of the clue, the thing I had so desperately sought, had become the final piece of the puzzle. A puzzle that I now realized would remain incomplete. It wasn't failure, not exactly. It was something else. A quiet acceptance of the fact that some things are beyond understanding, beyond explanation. Perhaps it was not for me to uncover every secret, to tie up every loose end. Perhaps sometimes the real truth lies in the spaces between the clues, in the things we cannot see. And perhaps for the first time I had learned that lesson. I took a sip of the whiskey then, letting it warm me from the inside, and allowed the silence to envelop me once again. The case was not finished, but it was something else now. A question without an answer, a riddle without a solution. And that, I knew, was as close to the truth as I was ever going to get.